Where do you think we stand in the world today, and where does the dollar stand in general?
So we're in a situation where we have, excessive debt.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Black Swan Capitalist YouTube channel. Today, we are honored to have Mr. Adrian Day with us. Adrian Day is a distinguished author and chairman CEO of Adrian Day Asset Management. Adrian brings over 30 years of experience in this field, and that means a wealth of knowledge to this discussion. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Adrian Day. I know you have a very busy schedule, so I greatly appreciate you taking the time to be here.
Well, thank you very much for asking me. This is going to be fun.
The pleasure is all mine. There is no doubt that we're at a turning point in history when we examine the US dollar, the weaponization of the dollar, its reserve status, the high interest rates, irresponsible monetary policies, not to mention that central banks are collectively impoverishing its citizens in the process, which is even unconstitutional if that means anything today. But it becomes very clear that this is intentional. So where do you think we stand in the world today? Where does the dollar stand in general? And then do you believe that the slow demolition of our financial system is an accident, or do you think this is intentional, designed to roll out a new system?
Yeah, I mean, since the dollar was delinked from gold, and since other currencies were delinked largely from the dollar, we've obviously had floating exchange rates. In principle, I'm not against floating exchange rates because I think prices should fluctuate to find their right value. The problem, of course, is when you don't have any kind of anchor, it has allowed both the fiscal and the central banks, both the fiscal and the monetary, in countries around the world to, frankly, become unhinged. Both literally and figuratively. And so we see excess spending by, I will say most, obviously there's some exceptions, but excess spending by most countries around the world and huge builds up of debt, whether it's Japan at 200% of GDP or the US and many other countries around the world, excess amounts of debt. And at the same time, on the monetary side, we have had, as you know, not just in the last 3 years since COVID, now everybody says, oh, well, it's just because of COVID. No, that's nonsense, of course. You go back to the so-called Great Financial Crisis in 2008. And frankly, even before that, it's been a slow and steady progress. I mean, you can go all the way back to the late 1990s, when Alan Greenspan was the Federal Reserve Chairman, and Alan Greenspan was supposed to be someone, well, he did understand, but he was someone who had an actual understanding of the monetary system and an understanding, of inflation, unlike, I would say, Ben Bernanke and Janet Yellen, who came later. But we had the beginnings of it back then. And the worst thing, of course, was the so-called Greenspan put, where he bailed out long-term capital, a hedge fund run by the, quote, smartest people in the world, in the room, bailed them out. And subsequently, we've had just excessively loose monetary policy. And of course, it's just got worse since 2009. And then in the last few years, it's got even worse. So that's happened mostly around the world. So we're in a situation where we have, excessive debt. And we're talking now particularly about the government level, but we have excessive debt. We have had excessively easy monetary policy. And the excessively easy monetary policy just led to excesses in the private sector. You had people taking out loans that they couldn't really afford to repay. You had, malinvestment on the part of corporations. I mean, anytime money is cheap to borrow, people borrow it and don't necessarily do the appropriate thing with it. So, yeah, I mean, I think we're in a very, very precarious situation around the world. And it's not just one country. If it was just one country, even the United States, the largest economy in the world, still at the moment, at any rate, it would be one thing. But when it's most countries around the world, then it's a very, very serious situation. You know, as to whether it's intentional or not, you know, I tend to be someone who, you know, I kind of apply Occam's razor to investments in the economy. The simplest explanation is most often the correct one. I tend to be a person that doesn't believe in grand conspiracies and, you know, organized destruction. I think it's just the foolishness and folly of man, frankly. But whichever it is, it's a very serious situation.
We tend not to believe these things as well to a degree, but we look at what they do and not necessarily just what they say.
Yeah.
And what I find very interesting about what I just said there is the fact that if you really look underneath the hood, it seems like there is no doubt that the new monetary system will be backed by hard assets, which would explain why central banks and financial institutions, in my opinion, are buying hard assets. And they're having these discussions about gold reevaluation. And then you have emerging technologies at the same time, like XRP or an XLM, in the form of a stable coin that help pave the way for this reality. Do you have any thoughts on that? If not, we can just move on to the next thing, which is wealth preservation.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I suspect, I mean, you know, people who are running the Federal Reserve, the Bank of England, the Swiss National Bank, I certainly don't always agree with them. And I certainly think they sometimes do foolish things, but they're not stupid people, or they're not unintelligent people, let's put it that way. And I suspect quite possibly, I suspect that 20 years ago, when the debt was building up and the monetary policy in many countries was a little bit loose, and, you know, we had the Fed put, which basically said the Fed would bail out any institution, any large institution that got into trouble. I suspect that they thought everything was sort of under control. You know, we've got this. And then you had the great financial system. Well, we'll throw $1 trillion at that in the first year, and more later, of course. And okay, we've years, they probably began to have some real doubts. Oh dear, I've lost you.
I'm here.
Okay.
Yeah, it's okay. It's just a little bit of lag. Sorry.
I suspect that they began to have some real doubts as to where this will end. That you cannot solve the massive debt problems around the world, the malinvestments, you cannot solve that with the traditional tools. I think they're beginning to realize this. So they will still talk. Jerome Powell still talks, and Yellen still talks about fine tuning and all that kind of stuff. But I think they have to realize that, you know, that's not going to work. I've often been asked, I mean, I'm a big critic of the Fed, frankly. I think they have acted very irresponsibly for a long period of time, particularly since 2009, of course, but even before that. And they are responsible for a lot of the problems in the economy and society, including, frankly, the extreme wealth gap in the US. Now, that's a slightly different issue you didn't ask me about. I don't want anyone to think when I talk about the wealth gap that I'm a socialist. But the problem is, or the issue is, when you have extreme wealth that's created by someone who is giving society things they want, whether it's, Steve Jobs and Apple or Mac, or whether it's some baseball or football player, or whether it's some awful rap singer that drives me up the wall, but people are paying for that out of their own money, and nobody, or very, very, very few people, object to those people becoming extremely wealthy. And that includes business people who create products that people want. But when it's because of government policy, when it's because of, when it's because of government distorting things, giving subsidies to big businesses, giving subsidies after 2008, as we all know, that was a bailout of Wall Street. It wasn't a bailout of Main Street. And so again, I don't want anyone to think that I'm a socialist, but when the money is being directed by government to certain favored people, the big money center banks, then people resent that. And that's, of course, what we saw up to 2008. It was the Federal Reserve directing money to favored institutions, in this case, the money center banks. So anyway, I got on a tangent there, I'm sorry. I'm a big critic of the Fed. But I've been asked, someone said to me, well, you're always criticizing, okay, if you were chairman of the Fed right now, what would you do? And I honestly think it's too late for what we might call normal, traditional policy prescriptions, raising rates a little bit, or cutting rates a little bit, or tightening the money supply or whatever. And the reason it's too late is, quite frankly, because, as everybody says, the Fed and other central banks are backed into a corner, and they really have, they're between a rock and a hard place, because if we've had the most aggressive rate hiking cycle in history, even more aggressive in terms of acceleration, percentage terms, than Volcker. We went from zero lower bound to 5 or whatever in basically less than 2 years. That's extremely aggressive. But we're only basically keeping pace with what the real rate of inflation in the economy is. And so in order to kill inflation, you've got to raise rates significantly above the rate of inflation, which is what Volcker did. He shot rates up well above the rate of inflation. People forget that from 76 all the way to end of 79, end of 79, people forget that, in fact, rates were going up consistently during that period. But the problem was they were not getting ahead of inflation. And so when Volcker came in, rates were already double digit. People forget that. When Volcker came in, the Fed funds rate was about 12%, but he jacked it up to 20% very, very rapidly and got in front of inflation, killed inflation. I don't think we could do that today, because there is just simply too much debt in the economy, in all parts of the economy, including, of course, at the federal government level, where the debt service on the service on the national debt, on the debt, is now the largest single budget item. We spend more on debt service. That's what we have to pay just to service the debt, not to redeem any of it, just to service it, not default, in other words. We spend more on that than we do on the military, than we do on Medicare and Medicaid. So can it get bigger? Of course it can get bigger, but there's a limit to how much more you can go. So I don't think they can do what is necessary to kill inflation. So they're really in a tough spot. I don't think there is there's certainly no easy solution.
With rising inflation, bank failures, and massive layoffs across multiple sectors, the future of the economy remains uncertain. It's no wonder the central banks have been getting prepared by stockpiling gold. At ITM Trading, we have spent over 27 years building a team of seasoned researchers and analysts who can help you prepare for any financial crisis. Our experts are ready to provide you with proven strategies to safeguard your wealth and assets in the event of an economic downturn or currency reset, which is frankly inevitable. Don't wait until it's too late. Schedule your free gold and silver strategy call by clicking on the link in the description below.
And there's a lot to unpack in what you said. First of all, being a socialist, I think you're being a realist. That's one way I would look at it. Like you said, they're stuck in a corner and they keep having to issue debt to service the debt that's so unsustainable. And they keep going in circles, and I think when we talk about interest rates going up or down at this point, like you said, kind of stuck in a corner, it's not really addressing the root cause of everything. So that's where I guess we can shift the conversation into wealth preservation and asset management. This is what you do. I think it's evident that the direction of where this is all going eventually, because they don't have a choice, it's going to have to go back to sound money. And despite what mainstream economists say, in my opinion, the trend is also underscored by the fact that the central banks and the big financial institutions are buying up all the hard assets and discussing about this, backing their currencies with hard assets. So, but given this context and the purchasing power of the dollar kind of going away, which people lose confidence in it, I want to know what your thoughts are on the BRICS nations, which is essentially an ideology for an approach to back their currencies with hard assets, sound money. So how do you see this shift impacting the global financial system? And of course, where does this leave the United States and the people?
Yeah, that's a huge topic as well. Because in a way, when you said, I'll disagree with one thing you said, when you said that, the BRICS is, and I think you said an ideology. I think what links the BRICS, there's very little that links the BRICS. China and Brazil and Saudi Arabia don't have an awful lot in common other than that dislike, nervousness, hesitancy about the US and the US dollar. That is the one theme that goes through the strand that connects all of the BRICS, is a concern, if you like, whatever word you want to use, about the US. Yeah, I mean, as everybody knows, you don't have to go back that far, and maybe 20 years, but certainly all the way from the end of the Second World War, the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944, all the way through Nixon taking us the final delinking from gold, all the way through to really the end of the 1990s, the dollar dominated both central bank foreign reserves and global trade. And those two things are separate, but they're following the same trajectory. But they're separate things. So if you look at reserves, for example, in the 1990s, something like 80% of all global foreign reserves, that's, not the yen for Japan and not the yuan for China and so on, but all of the foreign reserves were in the dollar. Global trade was even worse. Global trade, or even more extreme, global trade was basically over 90% of global trade, one party or the other, was using the US dollar. Now, both of those have declined significantly since then, but the dollar is still dominant. And the apologists, if you like, will say, look, trade is 54% of global trade is in the US dollar. 60% of foreign reserves are still in the dollar. You're hysterical, you're extreme, you're, But I'm often reminded of that wonderful quote that's been used many times recently by Hemingway about how do you go bankrupt? Slowly, then suddenly. And so these things take a long time. So to go from over 90% of your global trade in US dollars to 54%, okay, over 20 years, but that's still pretty dramatic in my way of thinking. And of course, it's accelerated in the last couple of years with the the last few years with the BRICS nation. Before that, it was more of a natural thing. Reserves, obviously, there's three reasons people have been diversifying out of the dollar. One is just simple prudence. When you've got 85% of your own foreign reserves in the dollar and the dollar goes up and down, forget any politics, forget anything else. You might just think it's prudent to maybe diversify that a little bit. When you're concerned about the fiscal situation in the US and what that might mean for the value of the dollar going forward, well, that's a second reason to maybe just reduce your dollar exposure. And then, of course, you mentioned it earlier. What's really accelerated that process in the last couple of years is the concern about the weaponization of the dollar by the US. And, people say, well, if you're not our enemy, you've got nothing to worry about. That's a sort of nebulous thing, because how do you know if you're going to be the enemy in the future? But that's not even true. You look at people that the US has punished. You look at Bank Paribas, a perfectly respectable French bank that made loans to Iran when it was not illegal at that time in France. Even worse situation, Banco Santander, a Spanish bank, loaned money to a Spanish real estate developer to build a hotel in Cuba at a time when that was perfectly legal, both with Spanish and European law, but it happened to violate US sanctions. And the US penalized both of those banks, Banco Paribas and Banco Santander, for violating US law, even when it didn't violate their own law, even when the US was not a party to the transactions, but the US was able to do it because, of course, they control the SWIFT system, which is where most international monetary transactions go. So those are just two simple examples where they don't affect France. It wasn't an attack on France or an attack on Spain, but friendly nations, reputable institutions, legitimate institutions in friendly nations coming under attack. And of course, we had the same thing earlier with Swiss banks and the Swiss banking secrecy, again, where what they were doing was perfectly legitimate under Swiss law, but they got penalized by the US. And of course, more recently, we've had sanctions on countries, in not just North Korea and Yemen and Venezuela, but most recently, of course, on Russian assets, where the US and the EU basically just stole Russian assets. The US is not, as far as I know, right now at war with Russia. They haven't declared war on Russia, but they basically just stole the assets. And so countries are beginning to say, well, we might be friendly with the US and we might remain friendly with the US, but maybe just prudence dictates that we have our assets, we have a large part of our national assets, our national reserves, outside of the control of the US. Right. And that basically means gold, doesn't it, at the moment?
Yeah, hard assets. The weaponization, though, that part I think is so important, because the countries, and we get information from the Middle East every week, from Saudi Arabia, and they're telling us the same thing. The rest of the world is tired of not just the US policies, but they're tired of the administration and the propaganda that's being exported outside the US too, alongside the inflation, which is not fair to other countries. So just the rest of the world is ready to move forward without the US. And that kind of ties us into the last segment of this conversation. Normally would talk about in these discussions is a fintech company called Ripple. When you really look into this, you see, and it's not just BRICS nations, this is even in the US, which is very interesting. There's a kicker here. It seems that this payment protocol has been implemented onto all the payment rails of these central banks. And it seems like they are going to be preparing for a monetary reset through a distributed ledger technology that uses a digital asset called XRP, which stands for Cross-Border Remittance Protocol. Interestingly, this technology also offers services like on-demand liquidity, which is pretty big, and it eliminates the need for pre-funding, which is also, I think, important looking at today's banking system. So, yeah, it's very interesting. There's a lot of information here, but if you dive into the documents I sent you, which I hope in the future we can have a discussion about this, that'd be great. It seems that they are building a two-tier monetary system, and one that is closed for the population and one that is backed by hard assets through stable coins. I find the convergence of just how everything is unfolding in the world today very interesting, given the current state of the geopolitical crisis. Our banking system, again, is broken. The middle class is impoverished, and it's only accelerating. I just think all these things play into a scenario of like a classic problem reaction solution setup. I know you're not particularly, enthused and engaged by digital currencies, but I would just greatly appreciate any insight on the documents I sent you or anything you could offer to this conversation.
Yeah, gosh, that's a huge topic too. Yeah, I'm very much an analog person, I'm afraid. I'm not a technology person, and although obviously there's some critical fundamental things one simply has to learn a little bit about, I don't like talking about things that I'm not an expert on. But I mean, clearly what you've said, clearly the central banks individually or collectively are moving towards both, both phases of what you said, which is, a currencies backed by something, which I suspect will include gold. And of course, the central banks are now front running themselves. Accumulating the gold before we get to that stage. But I don't think you could have I'm a great fan of the gold standard, as the classical gold standard, as it worked, in the 19th century. But I don't think we could return to that, certainly not, in the short term, because the differential between the value of gold today and what gold would have to be if you were in a gold-backed, 100% gold-backed standard would be too much of a disruption. But you could certainly have a currency backed by various assets that include gold. That's certainly possible and certainly likely. And as you say, we're also moving towards the digital, and the central banks are moving towards that for a lot of reasons. One is it gives them a greater ability to control citizens, frankly. It gives a greater, can you imagine if all transactions had to go through the Federal Reserve's digital currency? That gives them an enormous amount of power over individuals and corporations, what we say. There's been a big fuss, as you probably know, particularly in England, in the UK, although it's also happening in the US, about debanking people whose views are not particularly popular. And we're not talking here about Nazis, although even Nazis need a bank account. That's probably going to get me in trouble with some people. But we're not talking here about Nazis or extremists. We're talking about people who are, whatever you think of the policies, reasonably respectable people like Nigel Farage, who led Britain, the Brexit party. And he was debanked. This is not conspiracy. The papers, the documents were released by National Westminster Bank. He was debanked because people did not like his views on Europe and on immigration. And he is, middle of the road, if you like. He's certainly not an extremist. And that's an exceptionally dangerous situation. But if it's in the hands of the government, then it becomes even more dangerous, because you don't have any competition. You wouldn't have any competition. You would have no other place to go if all of the money is controlled. The system of money and banking is controlled by the government. So I think that's definitely one factor. The other factor, of course, is that it makes transactions easier. I'm sure that's part of the motive for moving that direction. It makes it easier, less expensive. Different countries, as you know, I mean, in the US, there's a lot of resistance to moving towards a cashless society. Less resistance in, say, some of the Scandinavian countries where they're more embracing it. I know obviously a lot of younger people like the idea of a cashless, a lot of younger people don't have any dollar bills in their pocket. Everything's on the Apple phone. But nonetheless, there is in the US a certain degree of resistance, not just from older people, about moving towards a cashless society completely, because of the dangers that I've just talked about.
We do believe, again, that this is mimicking the dot-com bubble, where the technologies building the infrastructure for tomorrow can make you incredibly wealthy if you own a piece of it. But at the same time, we're always encouraging people to hold hard assets. Mr. Adrian, I know you're very busy, and this has certainly been a fascinating discussion. I'm glad that I got the opportunity to meet with you, and I hope we can do this conversation again in the future. I have one last thing before we let you go. Do you have any final thoughts, anything you'd like to share with our audience?
Yeah, I don't think this will come as a surprise to people. As I mentioned, I'm an analog kind of person. We've talked about central banks front running themselves by buying up gold. I think the signals are extremely clear, it seems to me. They couldn't be clearer. But we individuals, we need to be accumulating gold at this point. Gold and silver, and as you say, other hard assets as well. But I would say particularly gold and silver. We need to be accumulating them while the prices are still reasonable.
Well, Adrian, it's been an absolute pleasure. I'll make sure to put your links in the description below where people can find you and check you out. All right, well, we'll be in touch very soon. So thank you, Adrian. I'll talk to you later.
Well, thank you very much for having me. Thank you.
Take care.